The room went quiet the moment I pushed open the conference room door. My son Daniel sat at the far end of the table, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression perfectly composed the face of a man who believed he'd already won. Beside him, my daughter-in-law Brianna crossed her legs and smiled at me, slow and deliberate, like a cat watching a bird with a broken wing. Their attorney, a young man in a suit that cost more than my first car, didn't bother looking up from his papers. Then Judge Patricia Okafor, who had agreed to serve as mediator for the guardianship proceeding, looked up from the documents spread before her, and she stopped. Her reading glasses came off. Her eyes moved from my face to the papers, then back to my face. Something shifted in her expression, recognition, and then something sharper. "Dorothy," she said quietly. "Not Miss Walsh, not Mrs. Walsh, just Dorothy. Dorothy Reeves Walsh." Daniel's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. Brianna's smile held, but her jaw tightened. Their attorney finally looked up from his papers. "You two know each other?" he asked. Patricia set her glasses on the table very carefully. "Miss Walsh spent 16 years as a senior investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division," she said, "and another 8 years consulting for the federal court system on financial fraud cases. I've had her testimony in my courtroom 4 times. She paused. "She is the primary reason a former county treasurer is currently serving 12 years in federal prison." I sat down, folded my hands, and looked at my son. His face had gone the color of old dishwater. "Hello, Daniel," I said. "Let's get started. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up sitting across from my own son while he tried to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs. It is not a short story, but I think you'll understand why I did what I did and why I'd do it again without hesitation. My name is Dorothy Walsh. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. Grew up in a house with 4 brothers who taught me that if you didn't fight for your seat at the table, someone would pull it out from under you the moment you stood up. I took that lesson to heart. I studied accounting at Ohio State, went to work for the IRS right out of graduate school, and spent the next 2 decades learning how money moves when people are trying to hide it. I got very good at following it. Numbers don't lie. The people arranging them do. My husband, Richard, was an architect. Where I saw patterns in spreadsheets, he saw them in skylines. We met at a conference in Chicago, married 18 months later, and spent 31 years building a life together in Portland, Oregon. He designed buildings that are still standing all over the Pacific Northwest. I helped put away 43 people who thought they were too clever to be caught. We had 1 son, Daniel. He was 41 now, worked in commercial real estate development. We had never been particularly close. My career made sure of that, but I thought we had a solid enough foundation. I thought he was a decent man. I was wrong about that, and being wrong about it is the thing I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Richard died 2 years ago. An aneurysm, sudden and merciless. He was there when I went to sleep and gone before I woke up. I had identified bomb threats and tracked money through 17 shell corporations, but I was not prepared for the silence of a house that used to have Richard in it. I was not prepared for that at all. Daniel came to the funeral. He was attentive, briefly. He called every Sunday for about a month. Then the calls became every other Sunday, then twice a month. Then Brianna started answering when I called his number, telling me he was busy but she'd have him call me back. He mostly didn't. I had met Brianna 2 years before Richard died, when Daniel brought her to Thanksgiving with the careful, watchful look of a man expecting criticism. She was 37, tall, wore her hair in a severe blonde chignon, and worked as a broker at a high-end real estate firm in Lake Oswego. She had the kind of polish that takes considerable effort to maintain, and the kind of smile that engaged every muscle except the ones around the eyes. I ran a quiet background check on her, old habit, and found nothing alarming. A solid professional record, a taste for expensive things, 1 dismissed civil complaint from a former client that had been settled out of court. I noted it and filed it away. Daniel had a daughter from a previous relationship, my granddaughter Lily, who was 14 and lived primarily with her mother in Beaverton. I saw Lily every other weekend and on school holidays. She was quiet in the particular way that highly observant children are quiet, not shy, just watchful. She had Richard's eyes and my tendency to notice things other people missed. 6 months after Richard died, Daniel and Brianna started showing up at my house unannounced. First it was dinner, then it was weekend visits, then it was Brianna walking through my rooms with a real estate agent's assessing eyes and comments like, "This place is a lot to manage for one person, Dorothy." My name is Mom, I thought, but I smiled and offered them coffee. The house was paid off. Richard and I had bought it 23 years ago, a craftsman on a tree-lined street in southeast Portland. Richard had spent 4 years restoring the original woodwork. The house was worth, according to my own research, somewhere around $900,000. I was not unaware of what that number meant to people who might be looking at it. The question started the way these things always start with performance. Was I eating well? Daniel would open my refrigerator, shaking his head slightly. Was I keeping up with my medications? Brianna would check the counter by the sink, making note of my pill organizer with the expression of someone cataloging evidence. Had I spoken to a doctor lately? They were always worried. Always worried. I'd spent 16 years watching people manufacture paper trails. I recognized one forming. Daniel began mentioning moments of confusion I supposedly had. He'd call and then, when he saw me the following weekend, ask if I remembered what we'd talked about. When I'd recall the conversation precisely, I kept notes. I'd always kept notes he'd look doubtful. "You sure? You said something different last week, Mom." I hadn't, but I noted the date, the time, and exactly what I had said, and I kept those notes in a locked file on my laptop. Brianna rearranged things. She'd come to help me tidy up, and afterward my filing system would be shuffled, a stack of papers moved, my reading glasses left somewhere I'd never put them. Then Daniel would stop by 2 days later and gently point out that I couldn't seem to find things. I started photographing every room before they visited. It was Lily who first said it out loud. She'd come for a weekend in October, and after Daniel dropped her off, she sat at my kitchen table eating the butterscotch cookies we always made together and watched me with those Richard eyes. "Grandma," she said, "are you actually forgetting things?" I set down my cookie. "No," I said. "I am not. I didn't think so." She was quiet a moment. "Dad asks me about you a lot, what you say when we talk, whether you seem confused." She looked at her plate. "I don't tell him much." Smart girl. Sharp, careful girl. The petition arrived in November. Daniel and Brianna filed for guardianship over my person and my estate, alleging that I was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The supporting documentation included a letter from a physician I had never met, a statement from Daniel describing 6 separate incidents of my supposed confusion, and photographs of my house that, viewed in a certain light, made it look cluttered and chaotic. My house was not cluttered or chaotic. The photographs had been taken during a visit when Brianna had, I later realized, spent 20 minutes rearranging my study before asking to use my bathroom. A social worker named Mrs. Connolly came to evaluate me. Mid-50s, careful voice, notebook in her lap. I understood what she was looking for, and I understood, with the clarity that comes from having built cases for a living, that I could not simply tell her I was fine. Anyone experiencing genuine decline would also tell her they were fine. What she needed to see was enough concern to justify continued monitoring, but not enough to recommend immediate intervention. I had to give her just that, no more, no less. I forgot the name of my street once during our conversation. I told her the wrong day of the week. When she asked me about my finances, I smiled vaguely and said Richard had always handled those things, which was a lie so complete it almost made me laugh out loud. I had a master's degree in accounting and had spent 30 years tracking financial crimes. But Mrs. Connolly wrote her notes, and her notes reflected a woman who might bear watching, because by that point, I already knew what Brianna had done, and I needed them to feel safe. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I had been in my garden in late September, cutting back the dahlias, when Brianna stepped onto my back porch for a call she clearly assumed I couldn't hear from the far end of the yard. She was wrong. I have always had good hearing, and there was no wind that afternoon. "The Kellerman account," she said, "needs to be reconciled before the end of the quarter. I don't care how you move it. Marcus, just make it look like standard disbursement fees." A pause. I know. But if Hendricks runs the audit in January and those trust accounts don't balance, we are done, both of us. I deadheaded 3 dahlias and kept my face arranged in the expression of a woman thinking about nothing more serious than the weather. That night I sat down at my computer and I became, for the first time in 3 years, the person I had spent a career being. Brianna's firm, Sterling Pacific Realty, handled high-value property transactions throughout the Portland metro area. As a senior broker, she managed escrow accounts for clients who were in the process of buying or selling homes holding funds in trust until transactions closed. I understood that world well. Escrow accounts are an almost perfect mechanism for slow, careful theft if you are patient and smart about it. Small administrative fees that don't quite match the disclosed rate. Disbursement timing that creates brief windows where funds can be redirected. Clients who are distracted by the enormous stress of a real estate transaction and don't scrutinize their statements the way they should. I made calls. I had contacts at the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation from a consulting case 4 years prior. I had a former colleague at the IRS field office in Portland who owed me a professional favor from a case we'd worked jointly in 2019. I was quiet and specific, and I asked only for information that was either public record or that I was owed by old obligation. What I found was this. Brianna had managed escrow accounts for 11 high-value transactions over the past 2 years. 3 of those clients had received disbursements that were, according to the standard rate disclosures they'd signed, noticeably short. The shortfalls were not enormous in any single transaction between $12,000 and $41,000 per account. But across 3 accounts, the total missing was just over $90,000. And those were only the 3 I could verify with the information available to me without subpoena power. I needed more. And to get more, I needed to get close to Brianna's actual documents. So I became the woman they wanted me to be. I let myself drift during their visits. I'd repeat questions I'd asked 10 minutes before. I left the stove burner on once deliberately, carefully, making sure there was nothing that could actually catch fire and made sure Daniel saw it when he arrived. I told Brianna the same story about Richard's college roommate twice in one afternoon. She told Daniel about it in the car on the way home. I know because I'd put a baby monitor in the hallway that morning. Old investigators' habit. Document everything. They stopped being careful. That was the thing about people who believed they had already won, they got sloppy. Brianna began taking calls in my living room while I sat 10 feet away, apparently dozing in Richard's old armchair. She left her laptop open on my kitchen table twice while she went to use my bathroom. The second time, she was gone for 11 minutes. I photographed every document on the screen. My hands were steadier than they'd been in years. What I found confirmed the pattern I'd suspected, and then exceeded it. Brianna was not skimming from 3 accounts. She was skimming from 7. Total discrepancy, $640,000. Moved in careful increments over 18 months into a personal account held in the name of a limited liability company registered in Nevada. The LLC's registered agent was a man named Marcus Drell, who was, according to Oregon court records, Brianna's former college boyfriend and current business partner in a property management side venture neither she nor Daniel had ever mentioned. I compiled everything I could access legitimately transaction records, disbursement statements, the LLC registration, Brianna's recorded phone conversations in my home under Oregon's one-party consent law, my own annotated timeline of events. I organized it the way I had organized every case file for 3 decades, chronologically, sourced, cross-referenced. Then I called the best attorney I knew. Carol Hutchins was 68, had been a federal prosecutor for 20 years before going into private practice, and had the kind of face that juries trusted immediately. She was also my closest friend, and she said exactly what I needed to hear when I finished explaining the situation. "Dorothy, you magnificent pain in the neck. I'll clear my calendar." 2 weeks before the guardianship mediation, Lily came to stay for a long weekend. On Sunday evening, while we were washing dishes side by side, she said, "Dad called me last week. He wanted to know if I thought you seemed worse." "What did you tell him?" "That you beat me at Scrabble twice." She dried a bowl carefully. "I don't think this is just about your house, Grandma." I handed her another bowl. "What do you think it's about?" "I think Brianna is scared of something, and Dad is going along with it because he doesn't know how to say no to her." She set the bowl in the cabinet. "Is that right?" "That's about right," I said. "Are you going to be okay?" I thought about 30 years of cases, of following money through countries and shell companies and layers of deliberate misdirection, of sitting across from people who had done very bad things and watching them realize they had underestimated me. "Yes," I said. "I am going to be absolutely fine." She believed me. I was glad, because I needed at least one person in my life to see me clearly. The mediation was set for a Tuesday morning at the offices of a legal firm in downtown Portland. Daniel and Brianna arrived early. I arrived exactly on time with Carol beside me, carrying a briefcase that contained everything I needed. When Judge Patricia Okafor retired, now working as a professional mediator, looked up and recognized me, I saw in her eyes a rapid recalculation of every assumption she had made about the morning ahead of her. Their attorney recovered quickly. "Your Honor, we have documentation establishing a clear pattern of—" "I'm sure you do," Carol said pleasantly. "We also have documentation, rather a lot of it." I looked at my son. He was watching me the way he used to watch me when he was 9 years old and had done something he couldn't quite defend. That particular combination of stubbornness and guilt that I had never found a way to reach through when he was a boy. "Daniel," I said, "I know you're not a bad person." He flinched. That was interesting. "However," I said, "your wife has been stealing from her clients, and you agreed to help her take my house to cover it up. So let's put everything on the table." Brianna stood up. "This is completely—" "Please sit down, Miss Walsh," Judge Okafor said, and her tone was not one that invited discussion. Carol opened the briefcase. She handed Judge Okafor a document summary, 53 pages, tabbed and indexed, and then distributed copies to Daniel's attorney, and after a pause, to Daniel himself. I did not testify the way I had in courtrooms over the years, from a witness stand with a jury watching. I simply spoke, calmly and without drama, the way I had spoken in depositions and hearings throughout my career. I walked through the timeline. I identified each of the 7 client accounts from which funds had been improperly diverted. I explained the LLC structure and Marcus Drell's role. I played 3 audio recordings made in my own home, all legal under Oregon's one-party consent statute, Brianna discussing the Kellerman account, Brianna telling Daniel that the guardianship petition needed to go through before January, and Daniel, in a conversation I was not supposed to have heard from the top of my own staircase, saying, "She won't fight it. Look at her. She barely knows what month it is." That one landed the way I expected it to. Their attorney made 3 attempts to object and was quietly and thoroughly redirected each time by Judge Okafor, who had the expression of someone who had not expected her Tuesday to go this way but was entirely committed to seeing it through properly. Brianna's composure broke at the 3rd recording. Not dramatically, she did not cry or shout. She simply went very still, the way people do when they understand that the thing they have been running from has finally caught up with them. She looked at her hands. Daniel looked at me. He had been looking at me for the past 20 minutes with an expression I had not seen on his face since the night Richard died, when he'd stood in the hospital hallway and looked young in a way that 41-year-old men almost never look. Lost. Genuinely lost. "The petition for guardianship," Judge Okafor said, "is dismissed. With prejudice." She set down her pen. "Additionally, I'm referring the financial documentation compiled by Miss Walsh to the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation and the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. Miss Walsh," she meant Brianna, "I would strongly advise you to have independent legal counsel present before you speak to anyone about anything." She looked at Daniel. "You are not currently the subject of a criminal referral. Whether that remains the case will depend on what investigators find." She closed the document summary. "This mediation is concluded." Brianna left without looking at anyone. Their attorney packed his briefcase with the brisk efficiency of a man who intended to bill for the full morning regardless. Daniel sat. Carol touched my arm and stepped away to gather our documents, giving me a moment I hadn't asked for but apparently needed. "Mom." Daniel's voice was the voice of a boy who had been caught, not a man who had decided to come clean. I knew the difference. I had spent a career knowing the difference. I didn't know it had gone this far. With Brianna and the accounts, she told me it was a cash flow problem, temporary. "And the petition?" I said. "That was temporary too?" He looked at the table. "She said you were struggling, that you needed more support than you'd accept on your own, that this was the only way to—" "Daniel." I said his name the way I used to when he was 12 and trying to explain why something was someone else's fault. He stopped. You knew I wasn't struggling. You manufactured the evidence that I was. I didn't want to believe. What you didn't want, I said, was the discomfort of admitting that your wife had done something very wrong and that the only asset available to cover it was my house. Everything else was a story you told yourself so you could live with it. He didn't argue. I respected that, marginally. Lily is going to come stay with me, I said. She told me she wants to, and given the circumstances, I'm going to support that request formally if her mother agrees. You will not fight it. He nodded. When you are ready to be honest, not sorry, not remorseful, honest about exactly what you did and why, you can call me. I stood. Until then, you know where I am. I left him there, sitting at that conference table in a room full of afternoon light, staring at a document that laid out, in precise and organized detail, the cost of believing his mother was someone he could afford to dismiss. The weeks that followed were administrative in the way that justice usually is, paperwork and waiting and incremental news, delivered by Carol in measured updates. The Oregon Division of Financial Regulation opened a formal investigation into Sterling Pacific Realty. Brianna surrendered her broker's license pending the proceedings. Marcus Drell was located in Scottsdale and was, according to Carol's contact at the DA's office, cooperating enthusiastically in exchange for consideration, which is the legal system's way of saying he told them everything the moment he understood his options. Brianna was charged with 7 counts of fiduciary fraud and 1 count of wire fraud. The total amount confirmed by investigators was $812,000. She pleaded not guilty and then, 3 months later, changed her plea when prosecutors presented evidence from her personal email account that Drell had handed over. She received 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to make full restitution. The firm she had worked for, which had apparently had suspicions of its own but not the documentation to act on them, settled with 6 of the 7 affected clients within 90 days. Daniel filed for divorce. He lost his position at his development company. They released a statement about company values and mutual decisions that fooled no one and moved into a rental in Northeast Portland. He started therapy. He told me this in a letter he sent 6 weeks after the mediation, a handwritten letter on plain paper that took him, he said, 4 attempts to write. Lily moved her things into my spare bedroom on a gray Saturday in January, with the cheerful practicality of someone who had been waiting for permission to do something she'd already decided. She painted the walls a deep teal, strung globe lights across the window, and filled the shelf above the desk with the graphic novels and dog-eared paperbacks that told me more about who she was than any conversation we'd had. Her mother, Jessica, was thoughtful about it, not happy exactly, but honest. She needs stability, Jessica said to me over coffee at my kitchen table. She needs someone who isn't going to fall apart. That's you right now. I appreciated her honesty more than I could tell her. Lily was careful with me the way observant teenagers are careful with adults they're not quite sure about yet, testing the edges, watching for the places where I might crack or disappoint her. She asked questions late in the evenings when we were both reading in the living room, the lamp between us and Richard's old record player turning slowly in the corner. "How did you know to start recording them?" she asked one evening in February. "Because I'd seen it before," I said. "People who are building a case make the same mistakes whether they're doing it legally or not. They over-document. They create more evidence than they need. Your father and Brianna were so focused on building their file about me that they stopped noticing I might be building one about them." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared? When you were doing it?" "Yes," I said. "Because the thing about pretending to be confused is that you start to wonder if you actually are. You question every small mistake. That's the cruelest part of what they were doing. Even fighting it made me doubt myself. But you weren't." "No, I wasn't. I turned a page I hadn't actually read. But proving it required trusting my own judgment completely, and that was harder than any investigation I ever ran." She absorbed that with the seriousness that I had come to recognize as her highest compliment. "Then, what happens to Dad?" "That depends on your father," I said. "He made choices that were wrong, but he didn't commit crimes. What he did was let fear make him someone I didn't recognize. Whether he becomes someone recognizable again is up to him. Do you think he will?" I thought about Richard, who had always believed that people were mostly trying. who had looked at the worst things I described from my cases and said, "They made terrible choices. That's not the same as being unreachable." I'd argued with him about it for 30 years and never quite managed to convince him he was wrong. "I think he's trying," I said. "I think trying is the beginning of it." She went back to her book. Halfway through a chapter, she said without looking up, "I'm glad you didn't just let them win." "I was not going to let them win," I said. And she laughed a real laugh, the kind that filled up the room, and for a moment I heard Richard in it, in the ease of it, and I was glad I was still here and still standing to hear it. Daniel came to the house in March. Lily was at school. I opened the door and looked at my son, who looked older than he had 6 months ago in a way that wasn't only the winter. I let him in but did not offer coffee. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain what I was thinking," he said. "My therapist keeps telling me to stop trying to explain and start trying to understand. There's a difference, apparently." He almost smiled. "She's not wrong." "Go ahead," I said. "I was always the one thing you and Dad hadn't gotten around to yet," he said. He said it without accusation, which I recognized as real work on his part. "You were so complete together, your cases, his buildings. I was adjacent. I was fine and loved and provided for, and I was also very clearly not the center of anything." He looked at the table. "When Brianna needed me, genuinely needed me, it felt like the first time I'd been necessary to anyone." I let that sit. "That doesn't—" "I know," I said. "It doesn't excuse it, but I hear it." He looked up. "I worked nights and weekends and missed things I should not have missed," I said. "I thought being provided for was the same as being present. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it for most of your childhood, and I knew it, and I kept making the same choice anyway. I looked at my hands. You made choices too, but you came by some of them honestly." He didn't say anything for a long time. "Lily won't answer my calls," he said. "Write her letters," I said. "Real ones. Tell her the truth about what you did and why. Don't explain it, just own it and let her decide what to do with it. She's sharp enough to know the difference between an apology and an accounting." "Like you," he said. "Like Richard," I said. "She has his patience." I never did. He stood to leave and then stopped in the doorway to the hall. "Mom, I want you to know that when I look back at it now, all of it, I can see exactly who you were the whole time. I think I was always able to see it. I just needed it to be different." He swallowed. "I'm sorry, not because I need you to do anything with that, just because it's true." I thought about 31 years of Richard saying, "They made terrible choices. That's not the same as unreachable." "Come back when Lily's ready to see you," I said. "We'll figure out the rest from there." A letter arrived at my door in April from my former division chief, now retired himself, living outside Sacramento. He'd heard about the case these things traveled, in the small world of people who had spent careers in financial investigation. His letter was one paragraph: "Never should have let you retire. Half the fraud in Oregon is probably owing to the fact that you stopped looking. Please keep looking. Some of us need to believe that someone still is. Tom." Lily found me reading it at the kitchen table and looked over my shoulder. "Who's Tom?" "Someone I used to work with. He's telling me I should take on consulting work again." She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "Are you going to?" "I'm thinking about it," I said. "Part-time. Nothing that takes me away from here." She nodded, satisfied with this as an answer. Then she put the kettle on and we had tea, and she told me about the history project she was working on, something about the New Deal and labor unions, and she had opinions about it that were, I noticed, carefully and specifically argued, following each claim with its evidence. I did not point this out. I just listened and thought that whatever else had come apart, this kitchen, this kettle, this particular voice laying out a careful argument about the Civilian Conservation Corps, this was the thing that had survived, and it was more than enough. Some people believe that getting older means stepping back, becoming quieter, smaller, less inconvenient. They see a woman past 60 and assume that whatever she was has mostly drained away, that what remains is manageable, soft around the edges, unlikely to push back. Brianna made that assumption. Daniel was persuaded to make it too. What they forgot was that I had spent 16 years in federal investigation learning to be patient, learning to watch and wait and build a case so solid that when the moment came, there was nowhere left to run. I had done it in offices and courtrooms and depositions. I had done it against people who were clever and well-funded and utterly certain they were beyond reach. I was not confused. I was not declining. I was not an easy mark in a paid-off house on a tree-lined street, waiting for someone to come along and manage me out of my own life. I was Dorothy Walsh. And I had spent 30 years learning exactly how money moves when someone is trying to steal it, exactly how people behave when they think they've won, and exactly how long it takes for patience and evidence and a very good attorney to make the truth unavoidable. They looked at me and saw a woman who had already faded. They forgot that the ones who've been watching the longest are never the ones you see coming, and by the time they remembered that, there was nothing left to do but deal with what I'd built.